It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream. With this
For more than 3 centuries, many different children of God have been coming to America, hoping to find it, or to make it, a land of freedom. Freedom to us nowadays, as to Martin Luther King, means above all political and economic freedom. But for the refugees who came in the early days to America, it meant religious freedom. Freedom to worship God as their consciences dictated. Freedom merely for their own religious views and ways to be tolerated. These are Mennonites living in Pennsylvania, descendants of radical Christians in 16th century Europe who were known as Anabaptists. Most of the Mennonites in Pennsylvania live ordinary modern American lives. But this particular group has become famous for clinging to the ways and clothes of the past. They're the old order Amish. They still speak a European language, a form of German, and they reject all the easy comforts of modern life, such as the motor car. A certain obstinate integrity causes these people to look old-fashioned. But the same quality of independence made their ancestors seem dangerous radicals. If their Anabaptist forefathers had flaunted their religion like this, they'd have been executed. Anabaptists have been chased from country to country for centuries. But this town of Mikulov in southern Czechoslovakia was their very earliest place of refuge. For 2 exciting years, from 1526, Anabaptists came from far and wide to seek shelter beneath this castle, invited here by the man who lived in it, Leonard von Liechtenstein. The movement had begun only 12 months before in Zurich, when a group studying the Bible decided to baptize each other. The conventional baptism of a dribbling baby, they maintained, was meaningless. Entry into Christ's church should be a solemn decision by a responsible adult. But this degree of self-reliance terrified the existing churches, Protestant as well as Catholic. And Protestant Zurich reacted sharply. Anabaptists were to be drowned, the town council decreed with macabre irony. If they want baptism, let them have it in good measure. A larger proportion of Anabaptists were martyred than any other single group, including even the early Christians on whom they modeled themselves. And all for what, to us, seems a very modest demand, a man's right to his own beliefs. Their voice was one which had not been heard for many years. It was the voice of ordinary men and women, prepared to stand up against all authority for conscience's sake. It's heard at its most moving in a letter, which a young Anabaptist woman wrote from Antwerp jail to her daughter of only a few days old. The woman's husband had already been burnt as an Anabaptist, and she herself had been reprieved only just long enough to give birth to her child. Now, she was about to die, and she writes to tell her child not to grow up ashamed that her parents were burnt as heretics.
My dearest child, the true love of God strengthen you in virtue, you whom I must leave in this wicked, evil, perverse world. Oh, that it had pleased the Lord that I might have brought you up, but it seems that it is not the Lord's will. Even so it has now gone with your father and myself. We were so well joined that we would not have forsaken each other for the whole world, and yet we had to leave each other for the Lord's sake. We were permitted to live together only half a year. Be not ashamed of us. Your dear father demonstrated with his blood that it is the genuine truth, and I also hope to attest the same with my blood. Hence, my dear Janikin, do not accustom your mouth to filthy talk, nor to ugly lies, and run not in the street as other bad children do. Rather take up a book and learn to seek there that which concerns your salvation. And now, Janikin, my dear lamb, who are yet very little and young, I leave you this letter. Read it when you have understanding, and keep it as long as you live in remembrance of me and of your father. Be not ashamed to confess our faith, since it is the true evangelical faith, another than which shall never be found.
Beneath the castle at Mikulov, there was soon a thriving colony of Anabaptists. They were welcome here, not only because the lord of the castle shared their faith, but also because they helped in his vineyards. But one colony rapidly turned into two. As the Catholics have always known, nothing leads to disagreement quite so quickly as reading the Bible. The argument centered on pacifism. One group found in the Gospels the message that one could use force to defend oneself. The others saw only complete pacifism in the Gospels and even communism, the need to share all worldly goods like the early Christians. There are today Protestant sects which descend from both these viewpoints, but even in Mikulov, persecution from outside soon put an end to the argument. The leader of one group was burnt and his wife was thrown to the Danube with a stone around her neck, and the eventual leader of the communists, Jakob Hutter, was whipped, brandy was poured into his wounds, and he was set alight. In spite of persecution, the Anabaptists persisted, moved into new areas, and survived, until they finally found shelter in America. But there were other Protestant minorities, such as the Huguenots in France, of whom the Anabaptists would have profoundly disapproved. This castle at Amboise belonged to the French royal family, who were Catholic, and it was the scene of one of the violent incidents in the Protestant bid for power. Many nobles had become Protestants. They felt themselves strong enough to demand tolerance, or even to seize it, and perhaps with it, the throne. Here at Amboise, the Huguenots hatched a plot which would have horrified the Anabaptists. They, after all, had only asked for freedom from the state. The Huguenots were very different. They tried to take over the state, and they fought for it with an unscrupulous ferocity which was rivaled only by that of their Catholic opponents. A group of Huguenots tried to kidnap the young King of France when he was in this royal castle at Amboise. The plot failed. The conspirators were taken into the castle, were tortured, and then were dragged out onto this balcony, where ropes were tied around their necks and they were flung over. Their hanging bodies were intended to impress the crowd outside. But it was said that the royal family, dining below, took a special pleasure in seeing their enemies dangling against the evening sky. On St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, they had an even more brutal revenge. Flinging Huguenots from balconies was becoming a habit. This massacre of Protestants took place in Paris. It had been ordered by the royal family, and it lasted 2 whole days. Huguenots were dragged from their beds into the street. Thousands died. In the struggle of the Huguenots for power, politics and religion were inseparably mixed. And for a while, the religious problem was solved with the easy cynicism of politics. In 1589, the heir to the French throne was a Protestant prince, Henry IV. But Paris would only accept a Catholic king. And so, with one of history's best-known throwaway lines, Paris vaut bien une messe, Paris is well worth a mass, Henry went to mass, became a Catholic, and became King of France. As king, he was able to pass the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed that even though the vast majority of Frenchmen were Catholics, no Protestant would be persecuted for his faith. But such personal protection from the king could only last as long as the king himself. When Henry died, persecution of the Huguenots soon returned. By the end of the 17th century, nearly 500,000 of them had fled from France, and Louis XIV had repealed the Edict of Nantes. Louis was soon even boasting that he had eliminated all trace of Protestant worship from his kingdom. But he was wrong. In the hills of the Cévennes, in the south of France, ordinary Huguenots, peasants and shepherds, persisted against all odds in their Calvinist faith. They fought a desperate guerrilla war against the king's troops. In one terrible autumn, nearly 500 of their villages were burnt, but the people resisted every persecution. After thousands of Huguenots had fled overseas, in particular to America, the king was determined to convert by force those who remained in France.
So it would appear we are being massacred for praying to God, as if that were an evil thing, to serve God according to the purity of his Gospels. His Majesty will allow us to say that if we are not granted our request to leave the kingdom or to assemble freely in the desert, then we will suffer any outrage that it should please His Majesty to attempt on us, rather than give up our faith.
The Huguenots called this part of France the desert, because here they would resist to the end, just as Jesus, in the desert, had resisted the devil. Nothing would terrorize these peasants back into the Catholic fold. Today, many villages in this area have no Catholic church. But in the days of persecution, the Huguenots had to practice a hidden faith. Their houses had secret places where a minister could hide when the king's dragoons came. The cellars of the houses were linked, so the man might emerge to safety as much as half a mile away. The cup for the communion wine would be formed of separate pieces, to be screwed together for a service in the open air. This is designed to look like a large grain barrel, but add the other parts which it contains and it becomes a handsome pulpit, something to give dignity and weight to a sermon preached in the woods. Many early accounts tell of the rare excitement, the sense of special occasion at those forbidden gatherings.
My aunt and uncle never missed the secret services which were held near our village, and I had pleaded for some time to be allowed to accompany them. I so fervently wished to see a minister. This they permitted. We left between 9 and 10 of the evening in winter, and we walked across the heather. Occasionally we did espy the lookouts who would point the way for us. After much walking, we arrived at the foot of a mountain. There, amidst the trees, there was a small opening. We entered and came upon a wooded clearing where, to my surprise, there were already gathered a goodly number of people.
Seigneur, lui dit la femme, tu n'as rien pour puiser.
In the Cévennes, Huguenots still celebrate from time to time an open-air service, in memory of those dangerous days when their ancestors held true to their Calvinist faith.
Ainsi que ses fils et ses troupeaux.
Often, on a Sunday, I did see on the tops of the hills lookouts who were there to warn the people gathered in secret assembly. Should they see any Catholic soldiers arriving, they could give the warning that the people would be able to disperse.
Vendredi, à Malabuis, un de mes catéchumènes m'a dit « Venez, je vais vous faire goûter de l'eau de la source. » Et il était très heureux de me faire goûter de cette eau qui est si bonne. Et je me disais, Mon Dieu, combien le bonheur est là, là, dans le goût de l'eau. Et c'est qui en le suivra, oh mon Dieu, quand on se rase, que les yeux verront ta face. Mon seul pain, ce sont mes larmes, et nuit et jour entre Dieu. Notre Père qui es aux cieux, que ton nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, que ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain de ce jour. Pardonne-nous nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons aussi à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Ne nous soumets pas à la tentation,
but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
This Nottinghamshire church was one of several taken over by English Calvinists. Puritans, their enemies called them, and as Puritans they were persecuted. They decided to leave England, but that was impossible without a license from the king. So they made their way secretly to the coast. To sail illegally, they paid a large fee to an English captain. He took their money, took them on board, and then double-crossed them. The leaders of the little group found themselves in these cells, in the ancient Guildhall at Boston. It was bitterly different from their hopes. And it was very different, too, from the great success which they would later achieve. Because this abortive escapade here at Boston was the first step in the long journey of the people we now know as the Pilgrim Fathers. With the Pilgrim Fathers, the central story of the long search for tolerance begins. When the Mennonites reached America, they remained a small minority, even to this day. The Huguenots, who went to the New World, merged with the English culture and so effectively vanished. But the Pilgrim Fathers, and those who followed them from England, played a large part in shaping that culture. And it was in English-speaking North America that the long battle for tolerance was finally fought out and won. But that was still a long way ahead. When the Pilgrim Fathers were here in the English Boston, they spent a month in prison. That was in the autumn of 1607. And then the next spring, they tried again to leave the country. But they'd learnt their lesson. This time they bribed not an English captain, but a Dutch one. He kept his bargain, and they set sail. At this stage, they had no thought of going to America. They were just aiming for Amsterdam. It was a city about which they'd heard exciting news. In Amsterdam, one of the pilgrims wrote later, "There is freedom of religion for all men." Amsterdam still has its reputation for freedom, for tolerating almost any dissident group. In 1976, this church was being used for a gathering devoted to the cause of revolution in Portugal.
Tudo depende da bala e da pontaria. Tudo depende da raiva e da alegria. A cantiga é uma arma de pontaria.
Some people today consider Amsterdam too tolerant, and so they did in the 17th century, when a critic described the place in a ringing phrase.
The fair city of Amsterdam, where all the peddlers of religion have leave to vend their toys, their ribbons, and their fanatic rattles.
The peculiar method of Dutch tolerance can be seen in a house on this canal. One religion was banned in Amsterdam, Roman Catholicism, not surprisingly after what the Dutch had suffered from Catholic Spain. But this ordinary-looking house contains a surprise. Its top 3 floors have been turned into a splendid Catholic church, now known as Our Lord in the Attic. Catholic worship was allowed to continue here for one excellent reason. It was out of sight, and so the Lord turned a blind eye. Licensed deviation, the most civilized custom which is still practiced in Holland. In full view of the police station opposite, there's a boat which caters for young people whose illegal but rather harmless interests differ from those of their parents.
Parents have come here to see the tulips. You are coming here to see another plant, the cannabis, the hemp plant. Take this top of the female hemp plant and get 1 seed out of it. Ladies. Hes hopsasa.
Marokkaanse 3,40 per gram, Katama 3,50, Turkse 3,80, Libanon rood 2,70.
A weekly radio program, run by the son of a cabinet minister, provides what sounds like the latest stock exchange figures. But these are the day's prices not of shares, but of different types of marijuana.
Congolese uitverkocht, Mexicaanse 4 gulden, Colombiaanse 7 gulden 50, Thailand 12 gulden, Indonesische 2,50 en Nederlandse wiet, onze nationale trots, 55 cent per gram.
Well, the Pilgrim Fathers had no need of that type of information, or that type of freedom. But they wanted something equally way out at the time, to worship God in their own way. Here in Amsterdam they found other sects doing the same. This church was already standing, built by another English group who'd arrived here earlier. In Amsterdam's free and stimulating atmosphere, radical religious sects tended to split up and reform with the same sort of solemn abandon as radical political groups today. Within a year of leaving England, the small party of Puritans had settled down so well in Holland that they felt free to quarrel among themselves. Half of them stayed in Amsterdam. The others moved on, still within liberal Holland. They established themselves very successfully in this city of Leiden. And it was the group here at Leiden which decided in 1620 that they would rather set up somewhere entirely on their own, not as one sect among many, but as the only sect. They had strong political reasons for leaving Holland. The Spanish army and the Inquisition were rather too close for comfort in what is now Belgium, and were always eager to move north. But I suspect that the Puritans also were tired of merely receiving tolerance. In a place of their own, they could go one stage further and try their own hand at intolerance. New England was awaiting them. The Pilgrims hired an English ship for the Atlantic crossing. They came from Holland to join her in Southampton. She was 180 tons, about 106 feet long, the Mayflower. This is a reconstruction built 20 years ago to commemorate the original crossing in 1620. It was already autumn before they set off. Bad weather ahead. In this crowded space, there were crammed over 100 pilgrims, as well as the ship's crew. Down here, they had to sleep, eat, store their personal possessions, look after the children, and even give birth to children. A boy born on the crossing was christened, appropriately, Oceanus, though by now most of the pilgrims must have been heartily sick of the ocean and everything to do with it. The crossing lasted nearly 10 weeks. 10 weeks in this, in the middle of the Atlantic. Already on the voyage over, there was a striking example of what the pilgrims like to call God's providence. William Bradford, one of the leading settlers, later told the story with immense satisfaction. There was on board, he said, an insolent and very profane young man, a sailor, who enjoyed baiting the pilgrims, shocking them with obscene language, or telling them that on a journey like this, he was fully confident before its end of throwing at least half of them overboard as corpses. But it pleased God, Bradford went on, before we were half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first to be thrown overboard. It was an encouraging sign of what God could do for his chosen people. The Pilgrims landed in November in New England, notorious for its hard winters. Bradford described in his diary those terrible first months.
But that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time, half of their company died, especially in January and February, being winter and wanting houses and other comforts. Being infected with the scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage and their inaccommodate conditions had brought upon them, so as there died sometime 2 or 3 of a day in the foresaid time, that of 100 and odd persons, scarce 50 remained. But the spring now approaching, it pleased God the mortality began to cease amongst them, and the sick and lame recovered. Though they had borne their sad affliction with much patience and contentedness, it was the Lord which upheld them, and had beforehand prepared them.
These houses are being built today with only the materials and the tools available in the 17th century. Here at Plymouth, where the Pilgrims landed, the local people are making a living museum. The original settlement, Plymouth Plantation, is being gradually recreated with all the details of the everyday life of the Pilgrims. The struggle and hard-won success of that first winter remains rightly an inspiration to Americans, a living symbol of self-reliance. Within 2 years, the Pilgrims were established, but desperately in need of more people. They sent back to London an account which made little of the hardships and much of the opportunities.
This bay is a most hopeful place. Innumerable store of fowl and fish, abundance of mussels, the greatest and best that we ever saw. Crabs and lobsters in their time infinite. The land, for the crust of the earth is a spit's depth, excellent black mould and fat. For the temper of the air, here it agreeth well with that in England, and if there be any difference at all, this is somewhat hotter in summer. The country wanteth only industrious men to employ, for it would grieve your hearts if, as I, you had seen so many miles together by goodly rivers uninhabited.
From the pattern of this first settlement, there would develop today's characteristic New England village, which would do without fences and have white painted houses sharing a lawn with an elegant white church. But the self-confidence which helped the Pilgrims to survive every disaster had a less attractive side once the dangers were past. The sense of being God's elect, so useful in times of hardship, turned all too easily into Puritan self-righteousness. At its most comic extreme, this was seen in a series of 3 resolutions, which were said to have been debated and passed by one New England assembly. They went as follows. Resolution 1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Voted. Resolution 2. The Lord may give the earth, or any part of it, to his chosen people. Voted. Resolution 3. We are his chosen people. Voted. And when a vast number of the local Indians died of smallpox, which had arrived here with the settlers, the governor of Massachusetts wrote in his journal, God hath hereby cleared our title to this place. In America today, there's complete religious freedom. But the families who first colonized Massachusetts and Connecticut weren't interested in that, except for themselves. Anyone else coming here would have to worship as they did. It's hard for us to imagine full-scale religious conformity, except perhaps by remembering American witch hunts as recently as the 1950s, for those who wouldn't conform politically.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would you please return to your seats for the minute of silence?
These children have perhaps the ultimate religious freedom. The old minute of prayer has been renamed a minute of silence. But a prayer without mentioning God stands revealed for what it is, a naked wish.
Please sit down for the minute of silence and think of whatever you would like for the day, whether someone in your family is ill, or there's something that you want, or something that you want for another friend.
Well, that freedom to think your own thoughts would never have been allowed in old Massachusetts, where every deviation from the correct Puritan faith was instantly punished. For unseemly behavior on a Sunday, you'd be whipped on Monday. The worst offense of all was criticizing God's ministers, and for that the penalty was banishment from the colony. The most distinguished man to be banished from Massachusetts was himself a young minister, Roger Williams. He had criticized the authorities for many things, including the way the colonists had taken land from the Indians. But above all, he argued that the community had no right to punish people for secret sins, for errors of conscience, which were a matter between themselves and their God. The magistrates decided to ship him out on the next boat to England, but he slipped away, and in a bitterly cold winter of 1635, he trudged south through wild territory until he reached the coast outside Massachusetts and settled. Over the next few years, other groups of people, unwelcome for various reasons in the older colonies, came to settle in this same area. And later they, together with Roger Williams, would form what became known as a haven of freedom, the new colony of Rhode Island. On the piece of land that Williams bought from neighboring Indians, there stands now the capital of Rhode Island, the city of Providence. This is the church where he used to preach. In Providence, everyone was welcome. Williams called it a shelter for persons distressed for conscience. The street names reflect the idealism of the place, but others at the time were less impressed by Rhode Island's tolerance.
The sink into which all the rest of the colonies empty their heretics, the receptacle of all sorts of riff-raff people, and nothing else than the sewer or latrina of New England.
But Rhode Island was described more fairly in its own early code of laws.
It is a place where all men may walk as their consciences persuade them, every man in the name of his God.
It was a place where a man might walk even in the name of a non-Christian God. This is the oldest synagogue in America, built by a community of Jews who in 1658 arrived here in the town of Newport, attracted by Rhode Island's growing reputation for tolerance. But the greatest test of Rhode Island's tolerance, which had passed with flying colors, didn't come from the Jews. It came from a very troublesome Christian sect, the Quakers. When they were banished from Massachusetts, they built this meeting house in Newport, Rhode Island. They were safe here, but they insisted on going back to Massachusetts to stir up trouble. Today we think of the Quakers as being highly respectable people. But in their early days, they were rather closer to hooligans. Inspired, idealistic, infinitely courageous, but nonetheless hooligans. They had arrived in New England in 1656, and in no time at all, a Quaker man was in a Boston church smashing bottles and shouting at the congregation, "Thus will the Lord break you in pieces." A Quaker woman streaked through the streets, stark naked. Another undressed in church, under guidance, of course, from the Lord. Massachusetts must have looked back with nostalgia on the minor troubles they had had with Roger Williams. The Quakers were banished, but they kept returning to testify to their faith, so new laws were passed. The first time back, a Quaker man had his ear cut off, and a Quaker woman was whipped. The second time back, the man lost the other ear, the woman was whipped again. The third time back, either sex had a hole bored in the tongue. The law was changed, a new penalty, death, and still they returned. By any standards, the early Quakers sound pretty and tolerable. But when they established their own city, in which to practice their form of Christianity, to their great credit, they kept the door open for everyone else. Philadelphia became known, above all others, as the city of tolerance.
We do remember that Quakers were basically a part of a Protestant movement which was not satisfied with religion of its day. And they refused to accept the fact that it was necessary to know God through a minister or a priest. They believed that, and I hope that we believe today, that we do not need someone else to interpret religion to us.
The Quakers, or as they call themselves, the Society of Friends, have no fixed form of service. One of the ideals of the Reformation was the priesthood of all believers. Well, here it is. Everyone equal, nothing but silence, until the Spirit moves someone to speak.
I think that we are very fortunate that the early Friends had the good wisdom, good judgment, not to write a creed. Because this makes Quakerism a growing and dynamic religion, and a religion that can encompass a great variety of beliefs, as long as there is sincere seeking.
The founding of Philadelphia as a city of tolerance in 1681 was the work of an English gentleman who had joined the sect of the Quakers, William Penn. When Penn made terms for his new colony, it was against his Quaker principles to seal the agreement with an oath. His treaty with the Indians was later described as the only one that was never sworn to and never broken. From the start, this sounded an idyllic place. The name of the colony was to be Pennsylvania, Penn's Woodlands. The chief city, set in a pleasant angle between two rivers, was to be called Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And Penn liked to describe his scheme as a holy experiment, by which he meant an experiment in people of different religious views living peacefully together. You were expected to believe in one almighty God, the creator of the universe, but that was about all. One of the advantages of tolerance rapidly became apparent when a suspected witch was brought for trial before William Penn. 10 years later, in Salem, in Strict, Massachusetts, suspicions of witchcraft would lead to mass hysteria and much bloodshed. But when the witch came before Penn, he said to her, "Art thou a witch? Dost thou ride through the air on a broomstick?" "Yes," she said. There must have been a gasp in the court. Penn replied that if she could ride on a broomstick, she had every right to do so. He, for one, knew of no law against it. He recommended that she be discharged, the jury agreed, and no more was heard of witchcraft in Pennsylvania. People flocked to a place as sensible as Philadelphia. The town grew, and with the Quaker example of hard work, it rapidly became prosperous. Today, a city of more than 2 million people is presided over by a gigantic statue of William Penn. And in the skyscraper age, they still keep to a city rule, which says that no one shall build higher than the brim of the founder's hat. It was in Penn's colony that the Anabaptists, or Mennonites, first settled when they came to America. A Mennonite farmer, Fred Martin, begins each day at 5 o'clock in the morning with half an hour of prayer. He's a full-time working farmer, but the local people have recently chosen him as their preacher.
And this is how you begin letting Jesus become Lord, or first in your life. Give God the first part of every day. Give God the first day in every week. Give God the first portion of your income. And give God first consideration in every major decision. And Bob says if you do these, you will find that Jesus Christ has become first in your life.
In fact, Fred Martin isn't a minister of the old order Amish, but they, like him, are Mennonites, followers of Menno Simons, a 16th century Anabaptist in Holland. The old order Amish refuse all modern inventions which might increase their own physical comfort. Not only the motor car, but also electricity, and in some cases even buttons and zips. But however old-fashioned these people may look, they also give generously to some startlingly modern projects within the Mennonite world, such as a special church devoted exclusively to the spiritual needs of the deaf.
You hungry?
Yeah.
So am I. Well, hi, Bob.
Life in Fred Martin's house is much like that of any other farming family, which takes its Christianity seriously. But there are differences. Fred's son, born into a pacifist sect, will have no difficulty in saying no if the state calls on all its young men to join the army. His Anabaptist ancestors suffered untold horrors to establish a principle which the Quakers later followed, and a principle which we now take for granted, that a man's religious convictions are his own affair, even up to a certain point, if they conflict with the demands of the state. That was the battle that the Anabaptists finally won.
Let's have a prayer first, Roger. Our Father in heaven, we thank you this morning for your love for us. We thank you for being with us during the night and keeping us safe. And we give you thanks now for providing our needs, especially for this meal this morning. We thank you and praise you for providing it for us. And we do ask that you continue with us throughout this day. Help us to be faithful to you in your service.
The long years of resisting the state, troubling the state, irritating the state, finally bore fruit. But then, God has a habit of freeing his chosen people at long last from oppression. There are stories about that in the Bible. For those who can partially hear, the preacher's signs are translated.
So Moses caused lice to come all over the land and went all over the people, and they started scratching their heads and their arms. Oh, it was a big bother. The servants were carrying things and they kept scratching their arms, and they put the food down, and the Pharaoh complained. He said, Moses, I'll let your people go. Just stop this lice. Moses said, you're going to let my people go? And then Moses ordered the lights to stop, and they all disappeared.
To his own congregation on that same Sunday, Fred Martin was preaching about the quiet insistence which has always given these small Protestant sects their strength.
I will bless God at all times. And you'll note that the psalmist not only says do this, but he's saying it takes an effort. I will. We must will to bless God, to give him a favored position. It's not emotional, it's a matter of the will.
Fred Martin, tilling the soil of Pennsylvania with his massively efficient tractor, is a very modern Mennonite. But his family is here just as much as the old order Amish because of Pennsylvania's principle, liberty of conscience. It was in honor of religious freedom that Philadelphia's bell was originally cast, the Liberty Bell, although it would later come to symbolize another freedom, freedom from England, towards the end of the 18th century. By then, the Liberty Bell had rung out loud and clear, not only for independence, but for the first occasion when an independent nation made religious freedom a matter of law. Both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were signed in this same group of buildings behind here. The Constitution said in 1787 that no religious test would ever be required by anyone holding office in the United States. And the Bill of Rights added 4 years later in its First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Freedom had been found and safeguarded. It sounds like a very satisfactory end to a long story. But it hasn't been quite so simple. These Mennonite ladies busy themselves with a nice, safe, old-fashioned sort of thing like making quilts. They also go in for good works, bundling up clothes to send as relief, wherever in the world it may be needed. During America's long war, they sent a great many truckloads to Vietnam. South Vietnam, naturally. But also, and here's the rub, they insisted on sending just as much to communist North Vietnam. The White House was not amused. Freedom from the state can mean many things. The Mennonites, with a tradition of independent thought, have taken it to mean freedom from the state's political prejudices. The demand for one liberty leads on to others.
for the Holy Ghost in one day will go around the world.
In the next program of The Christians, a black Pentecostal church in Philadelphia. The staid and polite religion of 18th century Europe was often transformed into something far more exuberant and joyful when it was exported to America.
Eradicate hatred. The Holy Ghost is an equal